and what responsibility is. It is at once evident that a defense conducted in this way is going to take a very long time, and also that what is really required is what Derrida was never able to supply: clarity, concision, concision, brevity, and strength of conviction and compassion. The problem too is that the defender's position is an impossible one. The best, quote, defense, unquote, might be to publish these writings entire, so that they are often on the record, saying briefly whatever can be said in mitigation, D. Man's youth, his possible ignorance, at least at the start, of what was actually happening to Jews in Europe, and that there may have been threats or dangers, so that he might have been acting out of fear rather than conviction. This might not amount to much, but I think it is actually all that could have been done. It would be neither necessary nor right for former friends and colleagues to turn against him and denounce him, but nor need they feel obliged to defend him. Intellectually, theorists might feel that if D. Man remained undefended, then deconstruction and literary theory would sink with his reputation, but defenses of him, which seemed to be motivated by that self-interested professional motive, would prove highly damaging. As a friend, Derrida did feel the need to defend D. Man, but he seemed to be using all the subtleties of deconstruction in order to do so, so that all those convictions about the unreliability of language and the fragility of notions of truth and the self were brought into play. The result was inevitable. Such concepts began to seem themselves morally suspect, for questioning the very concept of responsibility seems to glide towards denying that we are responsible for what we do and say. To write in the 1940s that, quote, a solution to the Jewish problem that aimed at the creation of a Jewish colony isolated from Europe would entail no deplorable consequences for the literary life of the West, unquote, gives public support for, at best, deportations, and it is especially shocking in view of D. Man's subsequent career as a literary academic that he endorses anti-Semitism as a literary intellectual. Page 281. Literary theory then was seriously compromised by the D. Man affair, and thereafter it never quite recovered its prestige, its confidence, and its sense of moral and political rectitude. Section. Jean Baudrillard, Baudrillard, and, quote, The Gulf War Never Happened, unquote, 1991. Indent. Reading. Jean Baudrillard, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place, Power Publication, Sydney, 1995. Christopher Norris, Uncritical Theory, Postmodernism, Intellectuals and the Gulf War, Lawrence and Wishart, 1992. Indent closes. As a result of 3 essays first published early in 1991, Jean Baudrillard, 1929 to 2007, became known in the popular imagination as the notorious French postmodernist philosopher who professed to believe that the First Gulf War never happened. The 3 essays were written respectively just before the war started, while it was in progress, and just after it ended, and were originally published in the French newspaper Liberation in January, February and March 1991, all 3 then being republished together in French as La Guerre du Golfe, N'(AS), Pass, Liu, Lieu, and in English translation as The Gulf War Did Not Take Place. Baudrillard was implacably opposed to Western foreign policy in the Gulf, and he uses a powerful and extreme rhetoric to make his points. The tone is savage and offensive, like the rhetoric of Jonathan Swift in the 18th century when he is attacking political corruption and social self-deception. For Baudrillard, what happened was not a war of the 500,000 Western soldiers involved. He says more would have died in traffic accidents had they stayed at home and became casualties, page 69, and the estimated 1 lakh casualties, page 2, were all on one side. This represents an, quote, entirely asymmetrical operation, unquote, page 19. But what is notable is, quote, the obscene aphrodisiac function fulfilled by the decoy of the event, comma, by the decoy of war, page 75. The sexual imagery builds up, quote, the war has unfolded like a long striptease, unquote, page 77, billed as a surgical war and typified by the footage relayed from the nose cameras of smart weapons homing in for their targets. The media event which the war became showed no actual human casualties and was typified by clean technological images of surgical strikes. But the striptease of the war culminated with television images of the horrific and merciless bombing of the retreating Iraqi army, page 282, on the Basra road at the end of the war. And the irony is that perhaps the most lasting image of the event is Kane Jarek's, Jareckes, widely published photograph of an incinerated Iraqi soldier in a burned-out vehicle after the bombardment. Para. From the point of view of literary theory, the great irony of Baudrillard's Gulf War essays is that they became victims of the very condition they diagnosed. Just as the image or simulacrum, within quotes, simulacrum, see chapter 4 of the war, in Baudrillard's accusation was wrongly taken to be the war itself, so the popular view of what Baudrillard was thought to have written was substituted for what he actually wrote. Hence, he became the whipping boy of anti-theorists and the target for high moral ground condemnations of postmodernism, which was now in the 1990s being seen as representative of literary theory in general, parenthesis, following the sequence of linguistics in the 1960s, structuralism in the 70s, and deconstruction in the 80s, parenthesis closes. In the caricature of simulacrum version of what he had said, the hyper-clever postmodernist quibbled about notions of reality and was indifferent to the suffering and death that, we were indignantly informed, had undoubtedly taken place even if Baudrillard thought the Gulf War hadn't. If we start by doubting the reality of the Gulf War, it was now suggested, won't we end by doubting the reality of Holocaust? Para. Whereas the real damage to theory in the D-Man affair was caused by his defenders, the damage in the case of the Baudrillard episode was partly caused by his attackers. Christopher Norris, who had defended D-Man over the wartime writings, felt differently about Baudrillard, for he had now turned decisively against rhetorical formalism in general and postmodernism in particular, seeing many aspects of theory as an abandonment of principles of rational objectivity and truth in favor of relativism, consensus, and pragmatism. The result was his angry and scathing book, Uncritical Theory, Postmodernism, Intellectuals, and the Gulf War, for in his view the Gulf War controversy brought all these issues to a head. Norris wrote in the heat of events as they were happening, responding to The Guardian's January 1991 edited version of the first Gulf War essay. He took Baudrillard's words to mean literally what they said, that the Gulf War will not happen, a proposition, he says, already refuted on empirical grounds, page 283, by the commencement of the bombing. As he says, and he is right, quote, perhaps it would be missing the point to observe that Baudrillard's predictions were flat wrong, unquote, page 14. Baudrillard is then lumped in with the theorists who had now become Norris's targets: Richard Rorty, R-O-R-T-Y, Stanley Fish, F-I-S-H, Foucault, and the rest. All those anti-cognitivists who argue that truth in any given situation can only be a matter of the values and beliefs that happen to prevail among members of some existing, quote, interpretive, unquote, community, unquote, page 16, seeing reality as, quote, a purely discursive phenomenon, unquote, that is constructed by codes, conventions, language, etc., is part of the same thing as is, quote, a prevalent misreading of Derrida's work, which takes him to be arguing, dash, in solipsist fashion, dash, that there is quite simply, quote, double quote, nothing outside the text, double quote, unquote. Puzzlingly, the alleged misreading of Derrida seems exactly the same as Norris's misreading of Baudrillard. Norris, in other words, reads Baudrillard as saying that there is literally nothing outside the media misrepresentation of the Gulf War. But why the double standard? Why is Baudrillard to be read only literally and Derrida only figuratively, so that the former always literally means that what he says and the latter never does? The postscript, Baudrillard's second Gulf War article, makes some concessions, but still ends by attacking Baudrillard's, quote, thoroughgoing cognitive and epistemological skepticism, unquote, page 196, para. Fierce though his attack is, it is surely the case that Norris and Baudrillard are essentially in agreement. Both deplored the unprincipled cruelty of Western policy in the Gulf. Baudrillard shows how the event was remade as it was happening, and a replacement reality of smart weapons and surgical strikes was fed to the public. In reality, which was Baudrillard's point, the vast majority of the weapons used in the war were anything but smart, and their effects are still being experienced today. The overall effect of theory's intervention in the Gulf War is that it became further discredited because it was seen, quite wrongly in my view, as subscribing to the erosion of absolute principles of truth and value and supporting tricksy blurrings of the edges between word and world, concept and percept, reality and illusion, imagination and event. The theory community had wrongly defended D-Man and wrongly attacked Baudrillard, and a third own goal was on the way. Page 284. Section The Sokal SOKAL Affair, 1996. Indent reading. Intellectual impostures, postmodern philosophers, abuse of science, Alan Sokal and Jean Bricmont, Bricmont, Profile Books, 2nd edition 2003, first published in French in 1997 and in English in 1998. Indent closes, para. In 1996, Alan Sokal, a physics professor at New York University, wrote a hoax article entitled, quote, Transgressing the Boundaries, towards Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, unquote, which was largely made up of what he considered to be a skein, S-K-E-I-N, of postmodernist cliches. He sent it to Duke University's Postmodernist Cultural Studies Journal, Social Text, which duly accepted and published the piece. On the day it appeared, he published an article in another journal revealing the hoax and arguing that the acceptance of the original piece exposed the vacuity of postmodernist theory and by implication of all cultural theory, given the preeminent status now enjoyed by postmodernism. The hoax became a celebrated and much debated event, but a significant element of its immediate relevance here is that Derrida is quoted in the article and later joined in the public controversy about it. Para. The original article is reproduced in Sokal and Brickmont's book Intellectual Impostures, Postmodern Philosophers, Abuse of Science, published in English in 1998. The book and the article are not a wholesale attack on postmodern theory, though they were widely taken to be that, but an exposure of the misuse of ideas derived from physics and mathematics by prominent French theorists, notably Lacan, Kristeva, Irigaray, I-R-I-G-A-R-A-Y, Irigaray, Baudrillard, Deleuze, D-E-L-E-U-Z-E, and Guattari, and others. Broadly, the scientific and mathematical ideas borrowed by the French theorists are those which seem to validate, quote, constructivist, unquote, or, quote, relativist, unquote, notions of reality. For instance, Heisenberg's, quote, uncertainty principle, unquote, Gödel's thesis regarding incompleteness, Einstein's theory of relativity, and so on. The implication, says Sokal, is that a good deal of postmodern jargon seems to have no very concise or rigorous meaning, and that, consequently, the editors of an important journal in the field were unable to recognize that the approved terms and formulations were being mixed and multiplied to produce an article which had no overall coherence or logic. If, when the hoax was revealed, the editors had simply acknowledged that they had made a mistake and needed to tighten up their refereeing procedures, page 285, then the whole business might have blown over very quickly. But they didn't, and a rapid escalation followed. For Sokal's comprehensive bibliography of the controversy, see http://physics.nyu.edu/sokal/impostures. Para. Because the accuser was American and nearly all the accused French, the hoax was seen as an attack on the standing of French intellectuals, and Julia Kristeva, one of the thinkers most harshly criticized in the book, responded in the French newspaper Les Nouvelles Observateurs with the view that after a period of Francophilia, the pendulum had swung back in the other direction, and what was now being witnessed in the USA was genuine Francophobia. Derrida is not one of the thinkers subjected to sustained criticism in either the original article or the book, but in the article he is the first theorist to be quoted, and the quotation is described as, quote, the article's first major gibberish, quote, unquote. Intellectual Impostures, page 244. The quotation rather oddly is from Derrida's off-the-cuff response to questions from Jean Hyppolite, Hyppolite, back in 1966 as discussed above, and Derrida refers to this when he comments on the Sokal affair, originally in the newspaper Le Monde and reprinted in his book Paper Machine, Stanford University Press, 2005, pages 70 to 72. In contrast to his intervention in the D-Man case, Derrida's comments are brief. What is usually quoted is just the remark, poor Sokal, referring to the plight of a physicist who is better known for his hoax than his physics. But Derrida too sees the affair in nationalistic terms. The credit being given in the USA to himself as a foreign professor was perceived to be excessive, so he is now attacked alongside other French writers for a fault, that of using in a loose way metaphors drawn from science and mathematics, which surely cannot be confined to the French. He would like to comment further on the American context and the political context, he says, but he has not the space to do so. Para. Overall, the Sokal affair does seem to have some of the nationalistic overtones perceived by Kristeva and Derrida. Having invited literary theory into the country in 1958 and 1966 and having played host to it for some 40 years, the intellectual establishment of the USA now seemed to be giving in its marching orders. The message seemed to be that the moment of theory had gone on long enough, and it was now time for the theorists to pack their bags and go home. Page 286. Given that postmodernism had come to stand for theory in general, as suggested earlier, the humiliation of postmodern theory by Sokal's hooks, which is how the event was generally perceived, was now seen as marking a comprehensive defeat of theory. It was undoubtedly the case that powerful forces in the USA were working to reclaim and re-Americanize the humanities syllabus, and these would gather pace as the 1990s went on. A general counter-revolution was taking place in American universities against a cluster of targets: political correctness, relativism, postmodernism, multiculturalism, among others, and these tendencies were hardened in the post-9/11 climate. As we approach the end of the first decade of the new millennium, pervasive anxieties about further terror attacks have made international gatherings more difficult, and to this has been added our growing concerns about global warming and carbon footprints. In some ways, too, the gatherings are less necessary in the age of email, video conferencing, conference calling, BlackBerries, social networking, and so on. Consequently, intellectual life has become more insular, more national than international in character, and literary theory has not been immune to these trends. Perhaps we can expect greater divergence in the coming decades between the versions of literary theory which hold sway in different parts of the world, rather than total dominance of the field by a narrow range of global brands. That surely is an exciting new situation, and one which already seems to be coming about, as the next chapter will illustrate. Page 287, Chapter 15, Theory after, quote, theory, unquote.